cuidado de esta tierra a lo largo de las generaciones y tierra muy querida. A las generaciones y a sus contribuciones pasadas y presentes a esta región. Reconocemos las injusticias que hemos cometido contra la nación Dakota y queremos interrumpir este legado comenzando con actos de sanación y la narración honesta de la historia de este lugar. Muchas gracias. Y creo que todos tenemos una gran misión que cumplir y la estamos llevando a cabo porque entre todos somos vecinos, amigos, comunidad, ¿verdad? Y creo que nuestros hermanos también, ellos también ya lo están viendo. Somos otras generaciones de armonía, de alegría y de paz. Ay, muchas gracias.
We are a community of different brothers and sisters, and we are here to heal each other. Thank you very much.
Good evening, and welcome. Legacy with the theme of welcoming and inclusive communities. This theme represents the foundation of the civil rights movement, led by Dr. King, which was based on the dream that in America, we live up to the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everyone. Perhaps stated best by Dr. King in his famous speech, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Each year, America remembers and honors Dr. King on this day, and so today, our community will as well. Even though the civil rights movement occurred several decades ago, the struggle for civil rights continues, and Northfield residents continue to come together to confront injustices against our community. Tonight, we honor Dr. King's legacy by continuing his movement's guiding torch of a welcoming and inclusive community for all. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our next speaker, the Mayor of Northfield, Rhonda Pownell.
Before Rhonda come to the microphone, I'm going to translate what Adam just said. Buenas noches y bienvenidos a la celebración comunitaria 2023 de la ciudad de Northfield del Día de Martin Luther King. Mi nombre es Adam Well y soy el presidente de la Comisión de Derechos Humanos de Northfield. Y estoy feliz y encantado de verlos a todos ustedes unirse a nosotros esta noche, mientras honramos a la figura más prominente de Estados Unidos en la búsqueda de los derechos civiles y humanos en la historia de nuestra nación. Este año celebramos el legado del Dr. King con el tema Comunidades acogedoras e incluyentes. Este tema representa los cimientos del movimiento de los derechos civiles liderado por el Dr. King, que es basada en el sueño de que Estados Unidos cumpliera su promesa de vida, libertad y búsqueda de las felicidades para todos. Tal vez lo expresara mejor el Dr. King en su famoso discurso, "Tengo un sueño. Sueño con que mis 4 hijos pequeños vivan algún día en una nación donde no se les juzgue por el color de su piel, sino por el contenido de su carácter". Dr. Martin Luther King. Cada año Estados Unidos recuerda y honra al Dr. King en este día, y hoy nuestra comunidad también lo hará. Aunque el movimiento por los derechos civiles tuvo lugar hace varias décadas, la lucha por los derechos civiles continúa. Y los residentes de Northfield siguen uniéndose para hacer frente a las injusticias contra nuestra comunidad. Esta noche honraremos el legado del Dr. King, continuando la antorcha que guía su movimiento de una comunidad acogedora e incluyente para todos. Damas y caballeros, acompáñenme a darle la bienvenida a nuestra oradora, la alcaldesa de Northfield, Rhonda Pownell.
Good evening. Thank you for having me this evening. It's great to see people back together to celebrate this really special occasion. Thank you to the Northfield Human Rights Commission, both past and present members, for hosting this Martin Luther King Jr. program each year. And to our many city staff members and city council members that are in attendance this evening for your work and support of this important event. I also want to acknowledge our Northfield Public School board members and important staff members, Nancy Antoine, Dr. Hillman. Could you all please stand, city council members, city staff, and our school board, please? Thank you so much for being here this evening, and thank you to Emmaus Church for opening your doors and providing a place to gather for this event, and congratulations on receiving this year's Human Rights Award. It is certainly well-deserved. Tonight's theme is welcoming and inclusive communities. This is a theme that we have embraced and lived out for many years. Our vision states Northfield is an open, safe, and welcoming community, recognized for its world-class colleges and historic riverfront downtown, and is dedicated to sustainably enhancing and preserving its vibrant culture, celebrated arts, strong economy, and an excellent quality of life where all can thrive. As our community looks to the future, we must keep this aspirational statement in mind as we work together for the good of all who call Northfield home. In 2016, the City Council adopted a resolution affirming the City of Northfield's commitment to be a safe, inclusive, and welcoming community. Our community is strengthened and enriched by the diversity of our residents. When we aspire to live to our highest societal values of acceptance and equality, to treat all of our neighbors with decency and respect, we are creating a vibrant community. We have long valued diversity within our community and have benefited from the diversity that exists within our community and the richness that it brings to all of us. We intend our city to be a welcoming and safe place where all people of all ethnicities, national origins, immigration status, sexual orientations and identities, skin colors, religious or non-religious affiliations, ages, economic status, and abilities can live, work, learn, and play. Our police department is committed to protecting and maintaining a safe and secure environment that enhances the quality of life for everyone in our community. And through the leadership of our Human Rights Commission and the implementation through our many boards, commissions, and city staff, as well as the City Council, we are seeking to secure for all residents equal opportunity in employment, housing, public accommodations, public services, and education. Each day is an opportunity to reaffirm our commitment as individuals and organizations to make our community a safe and welcoming place for all, to ensure safety, well-being, and equal opportunity for all Northfielders who call our community home. Thank you so much for being here this evening. And thank you, Francisco, for your assistance. Thanks.
Buenas tardes. Gracias por recibirme. Es genial ver a la gente reunida de nuevo para celebrar esta ocasión especial. Gracias a la Comisión de Derechos Humanos de Northfield, tanto a los miembros anteriores como a los actuales, para organizar el evento de Martin Luther King Jr. cada año. Gracias a la iglesia Emmaus, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it, por abrir las puertas y proporcionar un lugar de reunión para este evento, y felicidades por su premio. El tema de esta noche son las comunidades acogedoras e incluyentes. Ese es un tema que el municipio de Northfield ha adoptado y vivido durante muchos años. La visión de la ciudad de Northfield es una comunidad abierta, segura y acogedora, reconocida por sus universidades de categoría mundial y su centro histórico ribereño, y dedicada a mejorar y preservar de forma sostenible su vibrante cultura, sus célebres artes, su sólida economía y una excelente calidad de vida en la que todos puedan prosperar. A medida que el Consejo mira hacia el futuro, también debemos tener presente que esto es lo que queremos que sea Northfield. En cada decisión política, que con esta visión en mente. En 2016, el Consejo Municipal adoptó una resolución en la que afirmaba el compromiso de la ciudad de Northfield de ser una ciudad segura, incluyente y acogedora para todos. La comunidad de Northfield se ve reforzada y enriquecida por la diversidad de nuestros habitantes. Los habitantes aspiran a estar a la altura de nuestros valores sociales más elevados, de aceptación e igualdad, y a tratar a todos nuestros vecinos con decencia y respeto. Una comunidad vibrante para todos nosotros. La ciudad lleva mucho tiempo valorando la diversidad dentro de su comunidad. Nos hemos beneficiado de la diversidad que existe en nuestra comunidad y de la riqueza que nos aporta a todos. Intentamos que nuestra ciudad sea un lugar acogedor y seguro para personas de todas las etnias, orígenes nacionales, estatus migratorio, identidad y presentaciones sexuales y de género, color de piel, afiliaciones religiosas o no religiosas, edades, situación económica y capacidades. Mediante el liderazgo de su Comisión de Derechos Humanos y su aplicación a través de otras juntas y comisiones municipales, así como del personal municipal, la ciudad trata de garantizar a todos los habitantes la igualdad de oportunidades en el empleo, la vivienda, los alojamientos públicos, los servicios públicos y la educación. El Departamento de Policía de Northfield se compromete a proteger y mantener un entorno seguro que mejore la calidad de vida de todos los miembros de nuestra comunidad. La ciudad de Northfield afirma su compromiso con la igualdad de protección y servicio a todos los habitantes y visitantes. Muchas gracias.
Good evening, everybody. Good to see you and welcome to Emmaus. I was just apologizing to Francisco because I didn't get him a script, but he'll be translating, I guess, in the back for people. So, my name is Abe. I am the senior pastor here at Emmaus, and it really is wonderful to be hosting here in this space once again. I think it's been 2 or 3 years since we've been able to meet in person. And I think it makes a big difference. So thank you for being here. We gather here, of course, to remember the life of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and to consider his challenges for our nation, consider the challenges he gives to us as a people, and his vision for equity, equality, and integration. Integration was a major part of that call and that hope and that striving for equality. And of course, Dr. King, Reverend King, had a firm commitment to nonviolence and to peace in all of these pursuits. And I think that is another thing we want to try and remember on days like today. Before I finish my welcome, I promise I won't preach. When I stand here, that's usually what I do. I want to read just a brief excerpt from King's speech in 1967, Beyond Vietnam, a time to break the silence as he publicly had some words in challenge to our nation with that war. And I believe his words then are as important for us today. As I try to explain for you and for myself the road that leads from Montgomery to this place, I would have offered all that was most valid if I simply said that I must be true to my conviction that I share with all people the calling to be a child of the living God. Beyond the calling of race or nation or creed is this vocation of childhood, brotherhood. And because I believe that the Father is deeply concerned, especially for suffering and the helpless and outcast children, I come tonight to speak for them. This I believe to be the privilege and the burden of all of us who deem ourselves bound by allegiances and loyalties which are broader and deeper than nationalism, and which go beyond our nation's self-defined goals and positions. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, and for those that our nation calls enemies. Because there is no document from human hands that can make humans any less our brothers and sisters. And if you hold those same convictions, from wherever that conviction flows for you, let us join together as a community and continue to do that for the same values and the same hopes that Dr. King had, as challenging as that might be for us. Thank you for being here. Welcome on behalf of the Church of Emmaus. Welcome. And I look forward to conversing with you later. Thanks.
Well, it is my honor to introduce the speaker tonight. He couldn't be here. He's a professor. He couldn't be here because he spent today in reflection and in deep thought with his family. So he declined to come in person, but he sent the recording. Since we got it really late, we couldn't do subtitles for it, so we don't have prepared the interpretation, but if people that speak Spanish, and I will repeat this in Spanish, can sit in a corner and Francisco can talk to them, that would be great. And the speaker is Daniel Williams, is a wonderful professor that has participated in the Mapping Prejudice project in the Twin Cities. As you know, the covenants that were against people of color in many homes around the Twin Cities area, so he has participated in that. He's visiting Carleton and hoping to be permanent professor over at Carleton as a Mary Easter Africana Studies visiting scholar, and he is in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And the speech again is gonna be, his picture is tiny, so you will have to go online and see his picture. Es un vídeo, pero lo mandó ya muy tarde, con lo cual no hay preparada una traducción ni subtítulos. Entonces, lo que se nos ocurre es si se sientan todos juntos en una esquina y Francisco puede hacer resúmenes de lo que se va diciendo, porque si no, no van a entender mucho, lo que va a hablar es largo. Entonces, si se buscan un lugar, no sé, Francisco, donde quieras, quizás como en esa zona, si se pueden sentar allá y así Francisco les habla. Daniel Williams es un profesor de Sociología y de Antropología que está visitando Carleton College y justo estaba pasando todo lo de Viking cuando él estaba haciendo la clase, así que hizo una clase con sus estudiantes sobre Viking. Así que si buscan un lugar por ahí, perfecto, así Francisco puede hablar con ustedes. Thank you so much.
Good evening. I am honored to address you on this Martin Luther King holiday. Unfortunately, I'm unable to be with you in person, as it is a day I celebrate with my family with a meal, song, and conversation. I always appreciate being in the immediate presence of others and in the spirit of community. It's tempting to use cliched phrases and aphorisms to talk about the present moment. Still, it is astonishing to simply live week by week with the realities of what is happening in the world. It has been less than 1 week since a shocking and surreal riot took place in the capital of Brazil, Brasilia. The likeness of the event to our own riot and attack on the US Capitol 2 years ago is astonishing. We are also less than 1 month from a similar planned attack on the German Congress, where the Reichsbürger movement had strategized the overthrow of the German government and its replacement. These events share a common set of ideologies and worldviews, as well as tactics. They remind us that the struggles that are happening in our society are happening elsewhere, and that we have to have an awareness of the global dimensions of the problems of justice, and also figure out ways to bring them into the local context that we all live in each day. When George Floyd was murdered 2 years ago, protests erupted around the world. People of all backgrounds were outraged at the brutal and inhuman way that his life was taken. But for some, the murder was all too familiar. For Black and Arab French citizens in France, Floyd's death was recognizable and translatable immediately. In 2016, Adama Traoré, a 24-year-old French citizen of Malian descent, was chased by the police and killed for not having his identity card. He was one of many minoritarian French citizens who experience everyday racism in a nearly identical way as do people of color in the United States. In Germany, Germans of color recalled the death of Ori Jallo, an asylum seeker who died in police custody. Thousands of miles from Minneapolis, these communities needed no explanation and sadly were unsurprised at the tragic death of George Floyd. Race and racism not only circulate globally, they also move across different racialized groups. Just this past week, a young Asian American college student was murdered in Indiana by a 56-year-old woman who explained that she committed the act because she was quote unquote Chinese, that it was one less person to blow up our country. We do not know if the student was in fact Chinese. What we do know is that this word in the context of the United States has been a stand-in for all Asian ethnicities. As the first immigrant group to be excluded on the basis of ethnicity alone, the Chinese became the quintessential foreigners in the United States. But this transferability has historically worked in both directions. In 1982, a Chinese American, Vincent Chin, was beaten to death in Detroit, Michigan after being assumed to be Japanese. The context was that the US automobile industry was losing out to Japanese automobiles in the US market. But the Indiana perpetrator statement shows the transferability of race on another level as well. The linking of Chinese with terrorism, a racist notion, normally is linked with Muslims and people from the Middle East, thus illustrating the confusion and chaotic nature in which racist ideas move around from group to group and transfer from one ethnic group to another. These events underscore what I want to talk about today, namely the malleability and mobility of racism. I want to suggest that this is what we must be aware of as we work for racial justice. The apt title of Martin Luther King's last book is Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? I'd like to try to answer that question by way of reminding us of how we got here, as well as looking to other places that might help us to know where we are going. One of the most powerful stories I share with students in the classes I teach comes from a podcast titled The Invention of Race. And the story takes place in Virginia. We often forget that in the earliest days of the colonial period, race had not yet been fully encoded into one's status. There were Africans who came to America who were indentured servants and others who were enslaved. In 1640, John Punch, an African and indentured servant, ran away from his plantation, but he didn't run away alone. He was joined by a Dutchman and a Scotsman. The three were caught and were subjected to a trial, but then they were given different sentences. The Europeans got a mere 4 years of additional indentured servitude. John Punch got a lifetime servitude sentence as a result of his crime. It was the first time legally that blacks and whites were differentiated and treated differently. And with this act, whiteness was clearly associated with status and power. Of course, ideas about race had been circulating since the late 1400s, beginning in Europe, but in the American colonies, they only gradually became fully institutionalized and ossified into substantial social differences. This linking of social difference to an inherited characteristic was powerful. Racial difference became naturalized and its social origins erased. Once accepted as such, race became explanation in and of itself for a range of social phenomena. The idea that one has one's own kind of people, that one likes to be around their own kind, that some racial groups are better at some things than others, and so on. Once established, race could be used for all kinds of means and ends, but most clearly and especially for political and economic purposes. Some of my own teaching and research focuses on housing in neighborhoods. And in this work, I've collaborated with the Mapping Prejudice Project at the University of Minnesota. This project has uncovered the use of racial covenants in property deeds. These covenants are statements regulating the use and access to such properties. Specifically, they state something to the effect of, no person of the Caucasian race shall occupy this property. You can see that here on this slide, which has an example of an actual racial covenant from Hennepin County. In The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein discusses the ways that segregation in housing was enforced over the course of the first half of the 20th century. While discouraging in terms of the stories it tells, it is stunningly revealing also of the lengths to which governments had to go to make segregation a reality. In Palo Alto, California, in one story, a multiracial cooperative in the 1950s that hoped to buy land was blocked by the Federal Housing Administration because 3 of the 100 families in the cooperative were African American. In the same city, the city government decided to build a new high school as the other high school was becoming crowded, but also because that high school was racially integrated. And so where the high school was located in the center of the African American community was a way of resegregating the city and segregating high school students from another on the basis of race. Also in the Bay Area in Berkeley, California, a white teacher in the early 1960s was sued and fined for renting his house to a black teacher in a white neighborhood. Public housing was not only built and not only segregated during World War II, but the recreational activities in places like the YMCA were segregated, separating out the leisure time and recreation of African American and white children. Put simply, federal, state, and local governments bent over backwards to maintain, and if not maintain, then recreate segregation or create it for the first time, and in some cases for its own sake. In Minneapolis, we could see this in the way that neighborhoods became more, not less segregated over time. It's this part that may be encouraging, that there have been integrated communities and neighborhoods, but that in fact, policies gradually evolved to segregate them. You can see on this map that in 1910, the Minneapolis Black population in Minneapolis was in fact more integrated and less segregated than it was by 1940. This was a direct result of the beginning of racial covenants in Minneapolis in 1910 and their increase in use over the next 30 years. We can imagine some of these neighborhoods, if we know them, around the lakes, for instance, Lake Madé-Makaska and Lake Harriet, now considered high status neighborhoods and also overwhelmingly white today, but that in fact were places where African American residents lived and integrated into these communities. Housing, of course, well, let me say first just some of the other ways in which racial covenants led to more and other forms of segregation, government-sanctioned segregation in the Twin Cities, where I am also from and also where I've done some of my research. This is, of course, a redlining map of St. Paul in 1940. And redlining was a practice that began with the federal government in the 1930s to create a system by which banks would decide whether or not a homeowner was eligible for a federally insured loan. And so if you know the city of St. Paul, you will know that the red areas on this map correspond to areas where there are either high concentrations of people of color or very low income white communities. So especially the center area here in the middle of this map is the Rondo neighborhood, which my own family, part of my own family grew up in, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a minute. But the longer term effects, of course, were to create a stratification of neighborhoods in which more people were homeowners in white neighborhoods and fewer people were in Black and other minority neighborhoods. This system also led to other forms of disinvestment. So for instance, the freeways across the United States and the highway system, which went into place in the late 1950s, systematically and in an extremely clearly patterned way, went through Black and Latinx neighborhoods across the country. That was absolutely the case in St. Paul and Minneapolis when I-94 was constructed directly through the business district and historically African-American Rondo neighborhood. The possibilities at the time are quite interesting because there was an alternative route that 94 could have taken, which would have been along what we know as Energy Park Drive today, an already industrial area with railroad tracks and not very much residential housing, but it was viewed as more optimal to Route 94 through the center of this community. In the process, displacing and moving 300 families from home ownership to renter status and moving them out of their community and displacing 700 businesses. There's a tremendous amount of wealth that was lost in the process. And let me correct my numbers here. As you see, the actual numbers, 700 families or 700 homes and 300 businesses were displaced in this process. So these effects spilled into the future and spill into the present, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But I want to return us back a bit to Dr. King and his legacy. Naive interpretations of King reduce his message to one of morality. But really, Martin Luther King was quite clear on the economic and structural bases of racism and how deeply they were in the foundation of the country and how critical they were to dismantle if we were truly to get to the vision that he had for the nation. In 1966, a chapter we don't often and a date we don't often hear of in conjunction with Martin Luther King, Dr. King went to Chicago to address the issue of fair housing, dealing with the consequences and ongoing realities of the very policies that I've just described. And he faced resistance that was on par with the worst resistance that had been seen in the South in the earlier phases of the civil rights movement. As you can see here in the top photo, the name of the campaign. The campaign was known as the Chicago Campaign, and you can read on this banner that the objective was to end slums and segregation, right? So we're talking about directly taking on the history of segregation and slum-like conditions that were present in these neighborhoods. When he got to Chicago, and particularly when he got to some of the surrounding communities outside of the city, he faced massive resistance. Whites came out in the thousands, displayed swastikas, signs that said white power, direct racial epithets on signs, discharged firearms, and threw rocks and bottles. And in fact, the rock struck Martin Luther King during this march. That's the photo that you see here in the bottom right side, and others who are demonstrating in favor of open housing. So we have to revise a bit of our Pollyannish, or the more safe and comfortable notion of Dr. King, and view the later years of his life as well, and how important they are to understanding where he was going, and how it might connect back to our question of the malleability and the mobility of racism. So I want to actually show a short clip about that. In 1968, the year of his death, in a rare speech seldom seen, he articulated the economics of racism, understanding it not merely as a moral failing, but as a system built on power. And this is a very short clip. Good evening.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
Succeed, I can see in getting across. So, but what you can see there is, of course, King's outlining the economic structure of racism that he was quite clear on. And yet that's an aspect of his life that we seldom hear about. King was also forging alliances across racial lines, including with poor whites, as the 1960s progressed. And in the clip that I'll also be sending to you to watch, King clearly shows his understanding of the economic realities that undergird white supremacy and their connection to multiple communities of color. So here he mentions the importance of addressing poverty for not only African Americans, but for multiple other communities.
I guess I could use some of this time to get into pleasantries and to talk about the many experiences I've had with you, not only here, but in Europe and other places. What do you have in store for us this summer?
That's a good question. Well, I don't know about the summer. I guess I should begin with what we have in store for the spring. I feel that we are in the midst of the most critical period in our nation, and the economic problem is probably the most serious problem confronting the Negro community. And I might say the most serious problem confronting poor people generally. And I don't want to be narrow about this, talking only about the black poor in our country, because I must be concerned about Puerto Ricans who are poor, Mexican Americans, American Indians, and Appalachian whites. And we are confronting a major depression in the poor community. And I think the time has come to bring to bear the power of the direct action, the nonviolent direct action movement on the basic economic conditions that we face all over the country. Nonviolence has been a tremendous force in grappling with the social problem of legal segregation and the syndrome of deprivation surrounding that system. And of course it has been a major force in grappling with the political problem of the denial of the right to vote. But in winning victories like the Civil Rights Bill of '64 and the Voting Rights Bill of 1965 around the issue of segregation and voting rights, we discovered that these legislative strides did very little to improve the lot of the millions of Negroes in the ghettos of the North and in the nation generally. In other words, it did very little to penetrate the lower depths of Negro deprivation in communities all over.
Communities. And this was happening not only in King's campaigns and in his life, but it was happening across the country. This, for instance, in Chicago in the late 1960s, the Black Panther Party was forming an alliance with Latino, Native American, and poor Appalachian white youth activists to collectively address issues of poor housing, slumlords, overcrowded apartments, blockbusting, exclusionary zoning, and a range of practices that were faced by all of these groups. Notably, the Young Patriots, which was the group of young Appalachian white youth, at times felt threatened and even articulated racist perspectives on Black Panthers. But after this organizing effort, they were able to revise their point of view and see the commonality that they held with Black and Latino and Native American activists and communities in Chicago. This can remind us of John Punch and his compatriots before 1640, that is to say, linked fates and solidarity, the same problems, but with a different color. The longer legacy of these policies has been to create a well-known wealth gap tied to a gap in home ownership across the country, and a gap that is especially egregious in Minnesota, where the home ownership rate for African Americans is 25%, whereas it is 75% for whites. In Minnesota, whites do better than they do in the rest of the country, and Blacks do worse than African Americans in the rest of the country. So we have a bigger problem, not a lesser problem than in the rest of the United States. It plays out in what we call net worth, or the assets that a family or household possesses. Nationally, the wealth gap ranges between 10 and 20 times for whites what it is for Blacks. In Minnesota, the average median wealth is $211,000. For African Americans, it is $0. So we see a massive disparity that we need to address, and that is a direct legacy of the problems of the past policies that we've created. In research I began 2 summers ago, I interviewed homeowners of color in the Twin Cities, and with a specific focus on Latino homeowners. As a scholar of race, immigration, and housing, I wanted to understand Latino home ownership. Scholars know a great deal about the history of white and Black ownership, but much less about the Latino experience. There were, of course, many interesting findings, but one which stood out to me was the question of how Latino homeowners were feeling in the neighborhoods that they moved into. And to get at this, I asked a question that did not directly ask about race at all, but simply asked how comfortable homeowners felt in their neighborhoods. And in this interview, I asked A, who was a young homeowner living in a suburban community in the Twin Cities, how comfortable he felt on a scale of 1 to 4. And he responded, I think a 2 out of 4, just because the majority of people here are white. And what I've noticed is that besides the buildings that are nearby, the houses themselves are very affluent people. And so for me to be a person of color is just like I can very much see things being misconstrued as to why I'm there, especially since I'm new. No one had seen me before. So I hate to make assumptions about people, but I just, I got to be careful about that for sure. So here we are, more than 50 years after the passing of the Fair Housing Act and after the end of redlining, but living in a culture which still recognizes race as a signifier and a marker of disadvantage, danger, threat, or privilege, power, and dominance. And what we've created through these policies is effectively white space. We've created the sense in this young man who is quite successful, quite talented, and quite ready to live an American dream, the sense that he still may not belong in this community, and a sense of caution as he proceeds through his neighborhood. Another point I want to touch on, and this is about, I think, the direction that Dr. King was going in, which was to recognize that the struggle for justice had to happen across the color line and across the color spectrum, and particularly involve solidarities with other non-whites. We now live in a more complicated society in terms of race and ethnicity than we did 20 years ago. That is a fact. If we look at the rates of intermarriage across racial lines, they've gone from 3% in 1967 to 17% in 2015. And if we look at those people who are now considering themselves multiracial or of more than one race, the number, in fact, even in the last 10 years, jumped more than 100%, so that 3% of the US population, still a fairly small, but still a significant number, are seeing themselves as more than one race. I am also one of those people, and it comes out of my own history. But I think I want us to be cautious about this, because oftentimes this idea that somehow we are moving towards a majority non-white society implies that we are moving towards a more just society, a less white supremacist society, and a less racist society. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. And this is where we have something to learn from other countries and other societies. I'm returning from a 10-day trip to Cuba, which is, of course, a fascinating and unique country in its history and also in terms of race. What differentiates Cuba from the United States, beyond the differences in economic systems and political systems, is also that Cuba has a very large mixed race population and acknowledges, and always has acknowledged, that population as being mestizo or mulatto or mixed race. And yet Cuba, especially before the 1959 revolution, was doing no better than the United States. In fact, was doing worse in terms of racial inequality. The existence of a multiracial population did not solve Cuba's problems. It was, in fact, used to maintain a kind of white supremacy. The idea was that if we're all mixed, right, how can there be racism? Or the idea was, if I'm mixed, then I'm not Black, and so I am supposed to be opposed to or different from Black people in my own country. We may be moving towards this scenario in the United States, and I think we need to be cautious of this. When Barack Obama was elected president, many people were talking about a post-racial moment, wondering whether race had lost its salience as the key factor that mattered to one's ability to make it in America. But I think we have to now think of ourselves as in a post-Obama moment, even though it has been several years that Obama has been out of the office of president. We have to wonder now what America might look like, even as it becomes less white, as we struggle against white supremacy. What does it involve and what does it need? I was privileged this term to teach a class on neighborhoods and housing that included a civic engagement component. And our class decided to take up affordable housing and stable housing as our project for the term. We did this in Northfield, and for this project, we worked with Rice County Neighbors United, as well as the residents at Viking Terrace. And I have to here give a huge thanks to Marval de Cantos of Rice County Neighbors United and Jorge Zucaloto of the Residents Board at Viking Terrace for inviting myself and my students into their work. We learned a tremendous amount from residents and from the research we did on manufactured home parks. We heard difficult things about the symbolic boundary that is Highway 3, about going into restaurants and stores and feeling uncertain. But there were also things that I and my students heard and saw in our conversations and research, the tremendous pride that Viking Terrace residents have in their homes, their resilience and determination, their courage to live and move through Northfield every single day, and the reciprocity with which they live their lives in their community and in the city. And those things don't even begin to tell us about the other contributions these residents are making to this place, economically, culturally, and otherwise. Housing today remains possibly the most critical racial justice issue. We are in an affordable housing crisis nationally and locally. As my students found in their research, concentration of ownership, lack of information, the not in my backyards mentality are all fighting against the right of human beings and their families to survive, as well as to thrive, which is what we tell ourselves is the key value in this country. So Martin Luther King must not only be remembered for his appeal to our moral conscience, he must also be recognized for his deep understanding of economic injustice, the structural nature of racism, and that these were issues that affected multiple communities of color as well as poor whites. He recognized the global and interconnected nature of injustice, the hypocrisy of US violence in Southeast Asia, and the US condemnation of violent uprisings in cities where justice was delayed, if not denied. We must take a global perspective as well. As this country changes and race and racism shift their shape to suit new circumstances. I'm not in a position to state what killed Martin Luther King in 1968, but I can say that the direction King was going in at the time of his death was an affront to that moment just before John Punch and his fellow indentured servants were divided through the invention of a construct that would remake the world profoundly. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, that he couldn't be here, but wonderful speech and what we learned. I'm here as well to present, it is my honor and privilege to present the Northfield Human Rights Award this year to Emmaus Church. And this church has a big place in my heart, if you will. This is the place that has opened their doors to our work for years. This is not recent. This is not just with Viking. It's been a church that, as a good neighbor of the north side of town, that is the most segregated side of town, has opened their doors to their neighbors. And the work that Rice County Neighbors United did when we started working on housing. This church is where the city ID happened. All the meetings happened here, in the basement, up here. And throughout the years, many different initiatives happened here. And of course, with the issues that we're facing with Viking, they opened their doors once again to this room packed with people in fear, in agony, and in distress because of the company that bought the park, as you know. So it's very well deserved. This church as well has become the place where we celebrate Martin Luther King every year. And I was instrumental through the Human Rights Commission for this to be the place where we gather instead of finding a different place every year. So thank you so much. It's not just Pastor Abe, it's the whole team. It's people like Rob and April in the office and Vicky with the social justice group. So it's a very wonderful group of people. And I could keep going on and on and on how grateful I am because of them. And I'm going to translate this real quick into Spanish. Es mi honor y privilegio darle el premio de los derechos humanos a la Iglesia de Emmaús, no solamente por el trabajo que han hecho de abrir sus puertas cuando ha pasado lo de Viking, sino todo el tiempo cuando Vecinos Unidos empezó a trabajar en vivienda, cuando hicimos el ID municipal, también se reunió toda la gente aquí. Aquí es donde ocurrió en esta iglesia. Es la gente que trabaja con sus vecinos y vecinos de la parte norte de la ciudad de Northfield, que es la más segregada de toda la ciudad. Así que tenemos un agradecimiento grandísimo. Este también es el lugar donde se celebra esta celebración cada año. Y no solamente es el pastor, es todo el equipo, es la gente que trabaja en el sonido, es la gente que trabaja en la oficina, es un equipo grandioso de gente. Así que estamos muy agradecidos. So I present this award to all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, friends. To the Northfield Human Rights Commission members and to the Northfield City officials and to all of you present here tonight, it was with a great deal of humility we received this prestigious award in this year, 2023. With Martin Luther King being the one we truly celebrate tonight, as a group of people following in his footsteps, as well as the one who calls us together, we say thank you for this recognition. We must admit the news of this award came as a great surprise to us. Pastor Abe called me, I'm Vicki Dilley, as one of the co-chairs of the Emmaus Justice Initiative, along with my fellow chair, Doug Scott, who is hopefully listening in from his home in Montana right now. And along with our other steering committee members, Susan Quinnell, Rob Ryden, Abe Johnson, Randy Olson, on our particular steering committee, Abe asked us to be the ones that represent the whole congregation, which is a huge honor. Tonight, I also want to bring honor to those who founded Emmaus Church back in the 1960s and who decided then that we would be a community church, one that left our doors unlocked, ready for folks to walk in, who demonstrated hospitality, who put their initial modest church building on the northwest corner of the property, knowing that more neighbors would be joining us who knocked on, and these are folks who knocked on doors to invite other neighbors to join us. We saw the people of Viking Terrace as our neighbors, the children and faculty at Greenville School. I remember too many discussions about whether we should pull up the carpet, the old frayed stained carpet in our fellowship hall, and put in new. We were worried that somehow having something new and fancy would change the identity of who we wanted to be? Would we be too protective of this new carpet and start to change and not be so welcoming? We recently changed the carpet in this sanctuary, and I heard that same conversation again. I am pleased to tell you that the idea of hospitality and welcoming of all is deeply embedded in this place, way beyond any new carpet. Here at Emmaus, we use 5 symbols to capture our identity and ministries, and one of those symbols is a picture of a house. The house calls us to love our neighbor. This is a description of our history of reaching into our community, opening our doors to welcome everyone. I have seen this church open its doors to make room for a small school for middle school special needs students, for offices for community service organizations, for choir and orchestra rehearsals, for the Promise Church for Spanish speakers, and most recently for the residents of Viking Terrace, giving them a safe place to meet in the neighborhood. There are many churches and other organizations in Northfield who meet these same qualifications, which humbles us even more. So we would like to think that we celebrate the work of all the churches in Northfield who are touching the communities around them. We hope this calls Emmaus into the work of human rights and justice even more deeply as we live up to the honor bestowed on us today. Thank you.
We've expressed our convictions a lot tonight. And now let's take things one step deeper and let's sing them. Now, Ann will start. She'll introduce our first song to you. But be ready. Come on up, Marie.
Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive. Don't let the dream die. Got to keep hope alive. 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 Don't let the dream die. Got to keep hope alive.
shall not give up the fight. We have only started. We have only started. We have only started. We shall not give up the fight. We have only started. We have only started. We have only started. We shall not give up the fight. We have, that's it. We have only started. We have only started. We shall not give up the fight. We have only started. We have only started. Let's sing it. We shall not give up the fight. We have only started. We have only started. We have only started. We shall not give up the fight. We have only started. You can move, it's okay. We have only started. We have only started. We shall not give up the fight. We have only started. We have only started. We have only started. We shall not give up the fight. We have only started. We have only started. We have only started. Together we'll have victory. Hand holding hand. Hand holding hand. Hand holding hand. Together we'll have victory. Hand holding hand. Hand holding hand. Hand holding hand. We shall not give up the fight. We have only started. We have only started. We have only started. We shall not give up the fight. We have only started. We have only started. We have only started. Never ever quit to fight. We're out to win. We're out to win. We are bound to win. Never ever quit to fight. We're out to win. We're out to win. We are bound to win. We shall not give up the fight. We have only started. We have only started. We have only started. We shall not give up the fight. We have only started. We have only started. We have only started.
Okay, I think we have an opportunity if anyone would like to come up and share some stories about Dr. King, how it might have affected their lives. The mic is yours. Please.
I just want to tell everyone here that I found out just on Friday night that Will Smith, the famous actor, who also is a movie producer, has made his movie called Emancipation available for anybody to watch for free through Apple TV. So if you can get Apple TV, you can watch Emancipation for free. And it's very powerful. It's based on a true story, and it's set in 1863 when Lincoln had declared the slaves free in the South before the emancipation officially proclaimed in 1865 at the end of the war. This was during the war, and it's set in Louisiana and during full slavery. So you get a picture, a video of what slavery was really like. It's powerful and painful to watch. It's very sad, but again, it's based on a true story, and it shows how some people were treating others. It's painful to see how some people were treating others, as people were talking about tonight, and even using religion to back it up. And as we know, as Resma Menachem tells us, to shore up capitalism, again, as we were shown tonight. So I want to encourage you, if you can get Apple TV, to watch Emancipation. And also, I want to give you a quote from a friend of mine who wrote this in a letter to the editor in a different state, and I was touched by what he said. He said, MLK's vision went far beyond the laudable goal of racial equity. I should have said Martin Luther King's vision. He said, Martin Luther King said, quote, capitalism continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both black and white, unquote. And he also said, quote, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual doom, unquote. If he were alive today, he would be marching with the continuation of his Poor People's Campaign against poverty, against racism, militarism, climate change, and capitalism. That's from my friend, John Braxton. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Nancy Antwine, the principal at Bridgewater Elementary. I grew up in the 60s where a lot of this was happening. I grew up to a mom who was white and a dad who was black. And so riding that color line all my life was a journey and a challenge. And what I see through Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is a call to action. We have to be the ones that stop. We have to recognize when we see racism happening, we have to interrupt it. And we've got to repair the damages that have been done. Because I tell you what, our kids today deserve that. We have to make sure that we're the ones interrupting all the racist things that we see so our kids can be successful. Each and every single one of our students deserves to be successful, and they deserve to be judged by, again, their character and not this whole, hey, the pigment of our skin. It shouldn't matter whatsoever. And that's the job that I do on a daily basis, making sure that we interrupt that and making sure that we offer the opportunities for each and every single child to be a successful person. It was interesting to me because of all the work that's been done on Viking Terrace. And when we moved to town here 16 years ago, I was the one that, and I looked at my husband and said, this is just, Highway 3 is just really odd because how is this person supposed to safely cross Highway 3? And it was miraculous. After living in a community that was very diverse, coming here and seeing that we have a huge barrier there that's purposely put in place for our families not to get across the road to some of the resources they need. So as I go further into education, I realize that it is my job, and I know it's been my job from the very beginning to stand in the gap for our children, because if our children are successful, we're all successful. And I will not stop that fight, but I hope that you all have that same call to action where you realize that you can be that person. You can be that person that recognizes it, interrupts it, and starts repairing that damage, because that damage does not need to be done. It's unnecessary. We can be one body of people. We can be one race of the human race. And I hope I live to see that time when we will become one race, one human race, where we care about each other deeper than we care about our differences, because we have more in common than we ever will differences. Thank you for coming tonight.
Well, I would like to say thank you to the community we are, because when people are hurting, everybody came together We came together to do the city ID. We still are the only city in the state of Minnesota with such an ID, saying we all belong here. There are no differences. Whoever you are, whatever you're from, or whatever is your gender, you're here. You're part of the community. This is happening now as well with Viking, as you know. It happened before with the Northfield Estates. We come together as a community. We need to keep doing this strongly and assertive, in a very assertive way, because people are in the situation they are because of the systems we have in place, not because of who they are or what they want. I keep saying that we have people that are low income, but they're big in ambition. So let's start not talking about the poor or low-income people, low-resource people. We're talking about systems that are hurting people, and we need to interrupt those systems, and we have them here, but we can make a difference as a community. So thank you to everybody to come to those meetings to help your neighbors with your care and your efforts and your funds and whatever you can do to help and to show everybody that we care. So thank you so much. Northfield is a great community, but not yet. We can be the community we want to be one day. So that's our dream, and we're working really hard. So thank you to everybody.
I have to project. Okay, we neglected to get it on the program, but we do have the tradition of singing "The Circle Will Be Unbroken" together before the closing. So if Adam can just hold out for a minute. We shall overcome. Bob will help us out here. That's why I'm not doing this.
And the words are not in your program, but that's okay. I will give them to you. We shall overcome. That's the first one. This kind of feels like a stand-up song, doesn't it? It just kind of does, yeah. We shall live in peace. Live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday.
Okay, so on behalf of the Human Rights Commission, thank you all for joining us tonight in honoring Dr. King as well as Emmaus Church in their actions in support of Northfield and our people in their time of need. Thank you to Mayor Pownell for your leadership and support. Thank you to our keynote speaker, Professor Daniel Williams. Thank you to our musical performers, Arcadian African Drum Ensemble, and First UUC, Spirit Voices and Friends. And thank you especially to City Staff Liaison Claudia Garcia for all your work in organizing this. Thank you all, and good night.
En nombre de la Comisión de Derechos Humanos, gracias a todos por unirse a nosotros esta noche para honrar al Dr. King, así como a la Iglesia de Emmaus, en sus acciones de apoyo a Northfield y a nuestra gente en sus momentos de necesidad. Gracias, alcalde Pownell, por su apoyo y liderazgo. Gracias a nuestro orador principal, el profesor Daniel Williams. Gracias a nuestros artistas musicales de Arcadia African Drummers Ensemble y First UCC Spirit Voices and Friends. Y a la compañera de enlace personal, Claudia García, por todo su trabajo en organizar este evento. Gracias a todos. Buenas noches.